done, and I will put you on speaker view. There we are. You can start.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to this, the first of three, let's call them talks about Paul as a leader with case study in the first letter to the Corinthians. We had to narrow it down. And so this first talk is going to be about we call it clearing the tables about some conceptions about Paul. And for today, I'm going to take the lead on this whole talk. It's not going to be longer than 90 minutes. We'll take questions as they go, especially at the end of each section. And what we're going to do is to go through a few bullet items because some may approach Paul with fresh eyes because they have never heard anything about this person who lived in the Eastern Mediterranean region during the first century of our era. Others may have heard much about him, but may need an update because so much has happened in the field of Christian origins during the last 40 years that has made previous assumptions obsolete. Okay, so I'm going to switch to my PowerPoint presentation. So going to share screen. And there we are, starting the slideshow from beginning. Okay, so you can all see the PowerPoint presentation. So it's difficult to approach Paul without presuppositions. The long history of the reception of his letter, almost 2,000 years, has gifted us with several one-liners to capture what Paul is about before putting him aside. I simply remind a few of these one-liners. Oh, and I should say that this is our menu for today. So these are the various sections of this presentation. So first one-liner. One is, one way to capture Paul for many people is to say that he's the guy who came up with the idea of justification by faith rather than by works. Another one, very famous, is he would be the guy who wrote women should be submitted to their husbands. He's also known as the guy who fell off his horse on his way to Damascus. And here's a statue that was inaugurated in 2010 in London to celebrate, the anniversary of Paul's conversion. And well, they pictured him falling off a horse. And by the way, if you read the story in the Acts of the Apostles, there's no horse. And also, he would be the guy who would say that he doesn't do what he wants, but does the very thing that he hates, which made him a very anxious person at some point in his life. So for anyone who knows Paul's letters, these four one-liners are all problematic. And I hope to show why they are problematic during the first few minutes. So Paul was also not the most important figure during the first 4 centuries of Christianity if one considers how seldom the early Christian writers refer to his letters and how little these letters contributed to the elaboration of Christian orthodoxy during that time. From the 5th to the 20th century, the reading of Paul's letters, especially the letter to the Romans, have nevertheless had much impact by prompting some theological rearrangements in Western Christianity. first with Augustine of Hippo, whose doctrine of grace and original sin originates from reading the letter to the Romans in the late 4th, early 5th century. Second, with an Augustinian monk from the early 16th century, Martin Luther, who found in Romans a cure to his anxiety as a sinner. And third, with Karl Barth, a Swiss theologian, who in the years that followed the Great War dropped a bomb on the playground of liberal German theology with a commentary on the letter to the Romans that reaffirmed God's unique revelation in Jesus Christ. So let's now move to the second section of this talk, the earliest documents of Christianity. So once that's said, for anyone interested in the origins of Christianity, Paul's letters are the oldest written.
Can I interrupt you, Jean-François? Just you invited us to interrupt you if we had questions.
Yes.
Can you go one by one, the one-liner, and tell us whether they are right or wrong and why?
I'll tell you on as we go on.
Okay, so I let you go.
The letters, Paul's letters, were likely written around 50 to 60 Common Era, while the Gospels and the other documents that make the rest of Christian scriptures didn't exist yet because they came into existence between 70 and 120 Common Era. It's also telling that the earliest Christian documents are letters rather than narratives. Ernst Käsemann attempted an explanation for this phenomenon. The eschatological climate, that is, the expectation that Christ was going to return soon and overthrow the existing world order, renders pointless the creation of extensive literary works. These more extensive literary works appeared once the belief in Christ's imminent return had faded out of the horizon. Still, Paul's letters started an epistolary trend in Christianity that has endured. Okay, that was short. The next section is going to be far longer. So how do we know about Paul? So before we discuss what we know about Paul, I'd like to use a few minutes to ask how we know about Paul. The problem of obtaining information is indeed a complex one because we have two sources and they are not equal in quality. These two sources of information about Paul are his letters and the longest document of the Christian scriptures, namely the Acts of the Apostles, written by the same person who wrote the Gospel of Luke. 13 letters are assigned to Paul, while roughly half of the Acts of the Apostles tell about him from the moment he sees the death of Stephen to his arrival in Rome. At first, the sheer number of pages may give the impression that one has everything that one needs to know about Paul. A closer look at these sources mitigates that first impression. If we have 13 letters assigned to Paul, several were composed later and likely have little to no connection with Paul. This is the case with 6 letters, which leaves 7 for which there's agreement among the specialists that they are closely connected with Paul. Besides, these letters provide little biographical information about Paul because they mostly deal with situations that the early Christian communities encountered. The biographical information that they include is ancillary to other issues and therefore needs to be patiently gleaned from the letters. The scarcity of biographical information about Paul from his letters has led many to go to the Acts of the Apostles, that offer biographical information. Still, as has shown John Knox in his 1950 monograph, Chapters in the Life of Paul, we should be cautious about the information provided in the Acts of the Apostles, especially when it makes historically little sense and perfectly coheres with the agenda of Luke. For example, the circumstances of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus make little sense, historically speaking. According to the Acts of the Apostles, the high priest of Jerusalem had given Paul's letters that authorized him to arrest those who belonged to the Christian movement in Damascus and to put them in jail. On his way to Damascus, Paul had a vision and heard the voice of Christ. Following this experience, he became an ardent promoter of the Christ movement. If in his letters Paul affirms that he persecuted the church at some point, he says nothing about the circumstances that made him change his mind about that group, and the circumstances also that surround the narratives of this change of mind in Acts are implausible. To make an analogy, it would be like Jean-François Garneau receiving letters from the Archbishop of Montreal that authorized him to arrest Jean Hersault in Versailles and to bring him to Montreal where he would be put in jail. Good luck with explaining this to the police in Versailles that someone called when they saw Jean-François Garneau trying to arrest Jean Hersault. The Archbishop of Montreal has no right to have anyone arrested in Versailles. Similarly, the high priest of Jerusalem had no jurisdiction to have anyone arrested in Damascus, Syria. So both the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles show a predilection for Jerusalem, perceived as the center around which the characters of the story gravitate. In Acts, Paul goes at least 5 times to Jerusalem to take his orders and report about his work. Besides, he was educated in Jerusalem. In his letters, Paul swears that he has been to Jerusalem only twice and explains the circumstances that took him there. The first time to get acquainted with the apostles, and the second time to check something about his preaching. The discrepancy between the number of visits to Jerusalem in Paul's letters and the Acts of the Apostles raises the question of the reliability of Acts on this matter, especially assuming its predilection for this city. Similarly, the Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles show much interest for Roman officials, often by depicting them positively. One of the traits of these works is not to say anything openly negative against the Roman Empire, not unlikely to portray the Christian movement as inoffensive for the empire. Hence, we should not be surprised that Acts of the Apostles depicts Paul as a Roman citizen, a status that is questionable because on the one hand, the Romans didn't grant citizenship easily to foreigners, and on the other hand, because Paul never mentions his Roman citizenship in his letters, even though it could have been a helpful claim when dealing with communities established in Roman colonies. We therefore have good reasons to be skeptical about the biographical information that Acts of the Apostles provides about Paul, and to mostly rely on information that originates from the letters. We can add information from the Acts of the Apostles that has no incidence on the agenda of the Acts of the Apostles. For example, that Tarsus was Paul's hometown, and then he was a tent maker, a common trade in Tarsus. So just to give you a sense, Tarsus would be here. And this is modern day Turkey, modern day Greece. And of course, you recognize Italy. The other thing is that Paul was, Acts tells us that he was associated with the business of tent making, which was also one of the main businesses, important businesses in Tarsus at that time. So, bottom line, just let me back up. Bottom line, Paul's Roman citizenship is probably an invention of the Acts of the Apostles, along with his education in Jerusalem, his 2 frequent visits to the city, and his 3 journeys for which the letters provide no evidence, even though every 20th century printed edition of the Bible includes the map of these journeys on the back cover. So our main source of information to know about Paul originates from the letters that show a strong connection to Paul. From these letters, we learn a few things. First, that Paul was fluent in Greek. It would have probably been his native language in some way. That he knew some aspects of Greek rhetoric. That doesn't mean that he had extensive education in rhetoric, since he could have picked some tricks of the trade by listening to orators in public places. Also, that he cited the Greek translation of the Bible used in the Jewish diaspora. Hence, that he was a diaspora Jew. That he had studied extensively the Greek translation of the Bible. He can go back and forth in the Bible and creatively weave together different citations. He also identifies himself as a Pharisee, which could also mean that he has adopted the religious perspective of the Pharisees, that he has persecuted the church at some point, that he had also at least one mystical experience, and that at some point he adopted an apocalyptic mindset. So to this, we can add some information from the Acts of the Apostles that has no incidence on its particular agenda. So for instance, for example, Acts has Paul identify his hometown in Tarsus as Tarsus in Asia Minor. And Tarsus, by the way, was a city that Pompey made a Roman territory in 67 BCE. And it became later the capital city of the Roman province of Cilicia. So Paul is a Roman name. The most common explanation would be that Paul's family was for a time enslaved to a Roman official whose name was Paulus, a common name among Romans. When manumitted, he would have kept the name of his former owner, as was also common at that time. Paul is the only name he uses to speak about himself in the letters. Acts of the Apostles calls him Saul for the first part of the story until he meets with a Roman official, Sergius Paulus. After the meeting, he's called Paul until the end of the book. Any question for this section? Okay, should I keep going? Let's go. Now, I want to look at Paul within Second Temple Judaism. And because it will help understand what is the project that he has for the communities he has established and or supervised. So my claim here is that Paul leads these communities from within Judaism and towards Judaism. So Paul lived toward the end of the Second Temple period that went from 597 before Common Era until 7 Common Era, a period where Judaism was very different from the shape it has taken in rabbinic Judaism that developed after 70 and that saw the elaboration of the current Jewish literary corpus, namely the Jerusalem Talmud and the Babylonian Talmud, compiled between the 3rd century and the 6th century of our era. Since the Reformation until recently, Christian biblical interpretation has depicted Paul as someone who opposes the Judaism of his time. The problem is that Christian biblical interpreters have not been able to come up with anything better than a caricature of rabbinic Judaism to interpret Paul's milieu. This caricature portrays Paul's Judaism as a legalistic religion swamped in hundreds of regulations that crush the believer. It is also a religion where salvation is obtained through works. Salvation is also individual rather than collective. Ferdinand Weber's 1897 book, Jüdische Theologie des Talmud und verwandten Schriften, published again in 1897, illustrates well the perspective of Judaism as a legalistic religion. Weber describes the Jews as being in a desperate situation because they were conscious to have lost their status as the chosen people. Each Jew, according to Weber, is therefore on his or her own to attain salvation through the works of the law. By contrast, Christianity is depicted as a spiritual religion where salvation is granted by the grace of God. The main problem of this view is, on the one hand, that it's unsupported by the literary corpus developed by rabbinic Judaism from the 3rd to the 6th centuries of our era, because these texts show no evidence that Jews considered that they had lost their status as a chosen people. Besides, the text developed in rabbinic Judaism a knowledge that Israel often fails at obeying the law, which I prefer to call the Torah. Why I prefer to use the term Torah rather than law is that to limit Torah to law is to also miss everything that is in Torah. So I prefer the term instruction, which means also giving instructions to people about how to do things, but also instructs people, educates them in asking themselves how they should live. Torah is not only regulations, it's also stories and feasts, banquets, parties that are celebrated a few times every year. So it goes well beyond simply regulations. So Torah second, let me backtrack for a moment. So the text that Torah was something that Jews constantly failed at following exactly. But Torah also always includes ways to make up for one lapses. So there was no expectation in Judaism that Jews would be able to follow everything in the Torah. Jews acknowledged of that time in rabbinic Judaism, acknowledged that people constantly missed the mark, but it didn't make any problem because there was always ways to mend the relationship with God and to atone for one's sins. The main problem, though, of the Christian representation of Judaism at Paul's time is that it's based on text that came into existence in rabbinic Judaism, that is from the 3rd to the 6th century of our common era, where in the 1st century these texts didn't exist. Therefore, it's anachronistic to use these texts to understand 1st century Judaism. Also, in rabbinic Judaism, there was an acknowledgement of the written Torah, that is the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But at the same time, what developed in rabbinic Judaism was the oral Torah, that is the interpretations of the rabbis that were compiled during, let's say, at least 3 centuries. The Christian outlook on 1st century Judaism began to change with the publication in 1977 of E.P. Sanders' book, Paul and Palestinian Judaism. So let me tell you an anecdote that conveys the contribution of this book in changing the perspective in New Testament studies about 1st century Judaism. A classmate of mine in the doctoral program at Toronto School of Theology was telling me that he had been teaching New Testament studies in Kenya for 3 years. He taught what he had learned, that is the Christian conventional view of 1st century Judaism that I have just mentioned. As he was on his way back to Canada, he stopped a few days in London. There he entered a bookstore and saw E.P. Sanders' book, which he purchased. The cover is on your screen. As he read it, he realized that everything that he had been teaching about Paul's letters and 1st century Judaism for 3 years in Kenya was completely wrong. Even though 1st century Judaism was not monolithic, Sanders was looking for a broad common pattern of religion, that is, how to get in Judaism in Israel and to stay in Israel. He called this pattern covenantal nomism, in reference to the alliance that God makes with Israel with the Torah. Israel is expected to follow the Torah. Here's the pattern of covenantal nomism. First, God chooses Israel, gives Israel the Torah. The Torah implies God's promise to maintain the election and the requirement to follow the Torah. So God also rewards obedience and punishes transgression. It has nothing to do with salvation and damnation, simply obedience on a daily basis and transgression on a daily basis. The Torah provides for means of atonement. When you miss the mark, Torah includes a way to fix your errors. Atonement also restores the relationship with God. And all those who remain in the covenant by obedience, atonement, and God's mercy belong to the group which will be saved. So while Christian interpreters envision salvation as being individual in the 1st century Judaism, the text indicate that it's rather collective. Decide to obey the Torah for most Jews in 1st century, Second Temple Judaism is not something complex. It means keeping the 10 Commandments, the Sabbath, some dietary laws, circumcising male children, celebrating feasts such as Passover and the Day of Atonement, and making sacrifices at the temple for the birth of the first male child of the family, as well as for some sins. So when Judaism reorganized itself after the destruction of the Second Temple during the second and following centuries, it recentered around the Torah. Rabbis developed a sophisticated body of interpretation of the Torah that attempted to cover each type of situation, but also provided wiggle room by listing conflicting interpretations. Let's now move to this perspective that Paul was someone who was anxious. And this is a perspective common among Christians that likely originated with Luther, and it portrays him as a tormented individual because he fails to perfectly follow the Torah. Such a reading is based on a chapter of the letter to the Romans, Romans chapter 7, often understood as autobiographical, while it rather uses a rhetorical device called the diatribe that opposes a fictional non-Jews who adopts it opposes a fictional non-Jews who decides to adopt Torah, is unable to keep it, is unaware of the system of atonement, and ends up being miserable. So the diatribe, just to give you an idea, this is still very common in an advertisement. Remember all these advertisements that pictures Paul, who has chosen this product and is really unhappy about it. He's miserable. And he's opposed to Peter, who has chosen the other product, and the other product makes him a happy customer. So this is what advertisement does sometimes by opposing two people who have chosen different products. One is happy, the other one miserable. Diatribe in antiquity in rhetoric is the same process. You present first, usually first, the course that you shouldn't take, and picture someone going through that course and failing miserably, and you picture after the one who has chosen, who has made the right decision and who's doing very well. So that's exactly what chapter 7 does in the letter to the Romans. Pictures the one who tries to follow Torah, especially a non-Jew who knows nothing, who understands nothing about it, and he fails. And in the next chapter portrays the non-Jew who has simply adopted Christ, who simply does what Paul is telling them to do. And this person is happy and thriving. The problem with Christian interpreters, they focus so much on chapter 7 that they forget to read chapter 8. And therefore they completely miss the rhetorical effect of opposing two different types of behaviors. Actually, when you turn to Philippians chapter 3:6, this is something that Christer Stendhal, the former bishop of Stockholm and the former dean of Harvard Divinity School, reminds us. When you look at the letter to the Philippians chapter 3 verse 6, Paul says that he had absolutely no problem to follow Torah. He will say that he was blameless when it comes to follow Torah. And from there, Stendhal speaks about Paul's very robust conscience. And if you Google this article, Christer Stendhal, you'll find that that it's easy to find the famous article that he published in 1960 about this. It's a short article. It was the keynote address to a conference of psychiatrists, and it's called Paul and the Introspective Conscience of the West. And Stendhal challenges, in my sense, very successfully, this common assumption among Christian interpreters that first century Mediterranean people have exactly the same introspective mind as 16th century Western Europeans. If it were the case, there would be no trace of this introspective mind in ancient texts, especially texts from the first century. People didn't ask themselves every time whether they were doing right or wrong, were not analyzing themselves, introspecting themselves. This came mostly in the 16th century in Western Europe. And let me tell you also that I've been teaching in California for almost 20 years now to students from Asia, Africa, and all sorts of continents. And it's very true that in many societies, there's not that much introspection about yourself. So it's a Western, it's a Western trait that is often projected on people from ancient societies, and also sometimes on people of various contemporary societies.
Jean-Francois?
Yes.
I was thinking when we were talking about this that Descartes is such a great example in the turn in Western philosophy that comes a little after this moment, in which people begin to have a radical subjective view, which is then taken up by Western philosophy, not only theology, for another 300 years. Some would argue today it continues on. So there's almost a parallel development exactly what you're saying in terms of different fields.
Yes. And if you think about the Jesuit orders, the spiritual exercises of Ignatius of Loyola are nothing less than a deep introspection of yourself. And if you also look at Ignatius' suggestion of what he calls the examen, that is, at the end of every day, you should examine your conscience, asking yourself how you've lived through that day. This is also an expression of the introspective conscience of the West that came into existence in the 16th century. Now Paul shows no such introspective conscience, which also means that he may not have been anxious at all. And therefore, Stendhal's description of Paul as someone having a robust conscience may be a very good one.
I was just thinking another interesting parallel would be the development of psychoanalysis, and obviously schools that have followed in Freud's legacy, where again, the notion of introspection and guilt and anxiety become central constructs. And again, these are things that we project backwards onto Paul, but there's no necessarily psychoanalytic reading of Paul, just like there's no necessarily introspective reading of Paul with a radical subjectivity. So it's an interesting challenge.
Yeah, and if we fast forward, even we live in a post-Freudian era, and it's difficult to completely overlook the impact that Freud has had on our way to picture ourselves. And I don't mean that everyone is really well read about Freud. It just has permeated our Western societies to think about the conscious, the subconscious, the unconscious, and a few other things. It's really pop psychology that has permeated and very sometimes very much a distortion of Freud. But at the origin, it's Freud that really had an impact on our societies. what do we mean if Paul had this kind of Pharisaic outlook upon things? As it's the case with contemporary Judaism, first century Judaism was very diverse. And as it's the case today, most Jews didn't live in Palestine. So they were spread around the Mediterranean region. The diaspora Jews, that is, those who lived outside of Palestine, were likely to use Greek, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, except perhaps those who lived in Mesopotamia, who were Aramaic-speaking Jews, as were those who lived in Palestine. So Jews from the diaspora were unlikely to visit the Temple of Jerusalem at any time. Their religious practices, therefore, didn't include sacrifices done at the temple and centered exclusively around the synagogue. The synagogue was that center where people could pray, could receive religious instruction. It was also a center for community events and social life. That would have been the place in the cities of the Eastern Mediterranean where people would get together and would do networking for business, in addition with simply prayer and religious instruction. As a Greek-speaking diaspora Jew, Paul was not necessarily very fluent in Aramaic, the language spoken by the Palestinian Jews. So you can try to imagine that the difference of culture and language may at times have made difficult Paul's dealings with the people of Jerusalem, who were mostly Aramaic-speaking Jews. The thing is that we should assume that, as it's the case with many people nowadays on this planet, most of these people were at some point bilingual, so could manage in 2 or 3 languages. Languages would have been Aramaic in Palestine, Greek for the whole Eastern Mediterranean, some traces of Persian languages also in regions of the East. What Paul describes himself as a Pharisee in Philippians chapter 3, verse 6. This is really odd because there's no evidence of groups of Pharisees outside of Palestine. For this reason, we may believe that what Paul means here is that he's adopted the religious perspective of the Pharisees, not unlike someone can nowadays, call himself an environmentalist, even though they are not a caring member, they are not member of the Green Party. So you can claim yourself a Pharisee without necessarily belonging to the party, in the same way that you can see yourself as an environmentalist without being member of the Green Party. A few things distinguish the Pharisees from the other Palestinian Jewish groups. First, while some Jewish groups were centered around the Temple of Jerusalem, here I think about the Sadducees, or strongly rejected the temple, such as the Essenes, the Pharisees were mostly interested in the Torah itself, and in providing ways to all Jews to become better Torah-abiding Jews. The Gospels often pictured them arguing with Jesus about Torah and about issues related to the Torah itself. The second thing that distinguished the Pharisees from the other Jewish groups is that they had adopted this new idea in Second Temple Judaism, which is called the resurrection of the dead. The resurrection of the dead starts to surface as an idea in the book of the prophet Daniel, and is also found in the second book of Maccabees. So that was not a very common idea among Jews in the first century. It was spreading. One thing that you also find is that Jesus and his followers also had adopted the idea of the resurrection of the dead. Ideologically speaking, the Pharisees and the early Christians, the early members of the movement started by Jesus, are closer than with other groups. Another thing also that early Christians, early followers of Jesus, and the Pharisees have in common is that they are interested in the writings of the prophets and also of the other writings that make the Hebrew Bible. Some groups, such as the Sadducees, focused only on the Torah, the first 5 books, and considered that these were the only book that carried any authority as scriptures. The Pharisees considered that the prophets perhaps didn't carry the same weight in terms of authority, but carried, a weight that was really important. So they frequently turned to the prophets and the other writings to make their point. And that also explains why the Pharisees would have adopted the idea of the resurrection of the dead, which is found precisely in the prophets and the other writings. So another feature about the Pharisees is that they considered from reading the prophets that at some point all nations would converge to Jerusalem to worship the God of Israel. This is found at the end of the book of Isaiah. Hence, the Pharisees were very interested in non-Jews, in cajoling them to come close to Israel, because they assumed that by having non-Jews being interested in Jerusalem, in Israel, in Judaism, eventually they would help to realize the program set in the book of Isaiah. There's a moment in the Gospel of Matthew where Jesus teases the Pharisees by saying that they would cross the oceans to make a single proselyte. Of course, it's hyperbolic, but it also conveys this impression that Pharisees were trying to get people, to get non-Jews being associated in some way with Israel. If Paul has adopted the ideas of Pharisees, he would have subscribed also to this part of the program. One thing that is always puzzling for many people is, why is Paul so interested in non-Jews? Why would he travel hundreds of kilometers, put his life at risk to go to meet non-Jews? I think the answer is in this part of the book of Isaiah. If he's adopted Pharisaic idea, the ideas of the Pharisees about the nations coming to Jerusalem to worship, he's also trying to help make this happen. There are other aspects. There's his mystical experience, but this is also an important aspect that explains something of his interest in non-Jews. And here it's more than an interest. It's really something in which he invests all his time and energy.
Jean-Francois?
Yes.
I think that this helps us to think forward into our next talks as we go into discussing Paul's leadership. This frame is critical to understanding part of the drive, the motivation, or more importantly, just the act of leadership. What is he leading? Who is he leading? Why is he leading? So setting the table today allows us to get closer to when we start to unpack. If we ask the question, what does it mean to be a leader? And I don't think Paul would be able to answer that question, frankly, but if we tried to ask it in an imaginary conversation, this piece of the Pharisaic outlook, rather than being a negative template like it's portrayed in Acts, is actually a positive template for having him move through, as you said, hundreds of kilometers to go do this work.
Yes, and when we ask where is Paul leading these people, he's leading them ultimately toward Jerusalem. Something that's
François,
yes.
would this, I'm trying to be polemical here, but perhaps I'm totally off field. Would Paul be the equivalent for his days of the fundamentalist Christian in the U.S. who tried to rebuild the Temple of Jerusalem to bring about the end of times, but in a nice way as opposed to an apocalyptic way?
To a point, because one thing which is interesting with Paul, he has this apocalyptic mindset that shows up once in a while, but you see that it may not be a driving force. It may, I was reading a book by E.P. Sanders recently, and Sanders has reached a venerable age. And so he says, he's not afraid to say things bluntly. He says, oh, likely Paul had his bad days where he would wake up and he would see everything bad, and he would have this very, apocalyptic mindset saying that the world is going to hell. And other days, no, the sky is blue, the sun is shining, things are not so bad. So let's put aside the apocalyptic mindset for today and live as a person not guided through this. For many people in that century, there would be a sense of the world being governed by forces of evil. And there would be, for some writers, there's very little agency by people to govern their own life. One way that you can look at Paul also is that even if he partakes in that views once in a while, he will often insist that people have agency and are not prevented to act in a certain direction by forces that govern their lives. So he goes there once in a while, and he goes back. And you have to ask yourself also, would Paul be interested so much in the temple as Jewish fundamentalists are nowadays? The answer is probably no. He's a diaspora Jew. He lived his whole life without the temple. Probably don't see very much the need for it, because he never mentions that the Temple of Jerusalem and the cult in Jerusalem. But call him a Jew for Jesus.
Yeah, I think I'd rather go that direction. In fact, Jean-Francois Garneau, my concern would be to exactly read Paul as some kind of, the way you portrayed him, as a template for American Protestant fundamentalism in terms of the signs that you would see on the freeway that we see in the US quite often, probably are not in Canada, where it actually gives you the exact date when the apocalypse is coming. And those signs can be read if you've been living in California for the last 20 plus years. Several of those announcements came and they never, in fact, were realized. I think the more interesting analogy would be the Lubavitcher community in Brooklyn, New York, in which Jews, Orthodox Jews of a particular background, actually believe that Messiah has come in their time with their own Rebbe. To me, that's as much a parallel as anything like so-called American Christian fundamentalism. So I think we should be thinking about more of what actually Jean-Francois said around, I don't think Paul wakes up every day putting the announcement on the board or writing it somewhere in Corinth, here comes apocalypse, get ready. That's not him. That's not what's going on in the letters as far as I can read them.
Yeah, one thing though, when you think about Pharisees trying to cajole non-Jews in coming closer to Israel, is that it's probably not to be very successful. You don't get an impression in the first century of conversion en masse, massive conversions into Judaism. What you see in the first century among non-Jews in Greco-Roman cities was a high interest for Judaism because it was an ancient religious tradition with a literary corpus that was very diverse and very sophisticated. Stories also, that's sometimes our surprise, is that stories from the Hebrew Bible would circulate in Greco-Roman circles and would be known. So there was interest in Judaism among non-Jews, but there was always this reluctance to go through the whole process of converting to Judaism because it meant also, well, first undergoing surgery for males, also, following some dietary laws. And eventually, these, especially following dietary laws, renouncing idols would make someone's social life very difficult in a context where, celebration of pagan gods were everywhere. And, think about social relationships where you would go to a banquet and where meat would be served from animals sacrificed in pagan temples. So not many non-Jews really went through the whole course of converting to Judaism, but would be interested in knowing about the books, the traditions, would go also to the synagogues to do some networking and to know more about it.
One might say Judaism light, L-I-T-E.
Yes.
Goes back to Paul's servant leadership model, which is another interesting notion. Actually, it seems that Paul served up a particular form of Judaism that was in fact accessible to non-Jews. And he gave them a version of Torah light that allowed them to engage, which I think is also interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's the great idea of Paul, is to find a way for these people who are interested in Judaism to get in without all these restrictions of kosher surgery and being completely cut off their own society. Otherwise, the program of the Pharisees to bring them into Israel with all these items was couldn't be successful. Paul finds a way to realize this in as you say, making it easy to become associated with Israel.
But again, I think, which we'll argue and develop later, not so easy that you're simply saved, you've been elected, and now it's all good, relax. He's not quite like that. So we'll be exploring that more in terms of how he brings people in as a leader and then how he maintains, we're not going to say rules, I don't know what we're going to say, Jean-Francois, but some deep commitment to notions of ethics.
Yes. So that's our suggestion here, is that Paul is finally someone at work to realize the plan set in the book of Isaiah. And that takes seriously his Jewish identity and also his interest in the ideas of the Pharisees. Okay, one thing also that we should consider is what do we mean by Paul's letters? Because as I explained earlier, if you want to know about Paul, the place to go are the letters. The Acts of the Apostles, even though they provide a lot of information, provide information that is not necessarily very reliable to know about Paul. So you have to go through the letters. problem again is that you have 13 letters associated with Paul. Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians, 2 Thessalonians, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, Titus, Philemon, 13 of them. Through the centuries, especially since the late 18th century, there's been some questions about how, some letters are connected or not with Paul. So nowadays, the consensus is that 7 letters are closely connected with Paul. Here's the list: Romans, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1 Thessalonians, and Philemon. By the way, Philemon, the letter to the Philemon, is a single page. It's, if you flip through the pages of a printed edition of the New Testament, you're likely to go past it, to miss it. Now, there are other letters which are considered to be loosely connected with Paul. And I list them in the order of hesitancy about their connection. 2 Thessalonians, let's say 50% of specialists, half of them would say that it's closely connected with Paul. The other half would say, no, it has nothing to do with Paul. The same thing with Colossians. When you come to to Ephesians, there's a minority of scholars who consider that Ephesians is connected with Paul. And usually you're speaking about conservative specialists, usually associated with evangelical churches, who consider that Paul has a connection with Ephesians. Ephesians is the place where you find that wives should be submitted to their husband. If you consider this this very famous one-liner about Paul may not come from Paul at all. 2 Timothy, there are even less specialists who consider that it has connection with Paul. 1 Timothy and Titus are usually assumed to have been written in the early 2nd century, 110, 120, something like 50 or 60 years after Paul. They call it Paul's second hand. So that's our collection of Paul's letters, 7 letters. Now, let me go to a book that came out in 1909 by Adolf Deismann. Deismann, at the beginning of the 20th century, looked at several ancient letters found usually mostly in Egypt, letters from the 1st century. So he read hundreds of them, compiled them, studied them carefully, and came with this very blunt and bold statement at that time that Paul's letters are finally letters, real letters. Because with the development of the Christian tradition, people started to look at Paul's letters not anymore as letters, but as theological, theological treaties, a traité de théologie. So they had completely forgotten that we're talking about letters. And when we're talking about letters, it means that these letters are addressed to real people, addressed also the issues encountered by real people, answer the questions asked by these people. So in many ways, they are one half of a conversation between Paul and communities. And some of the questions that Paul answers in these letters came also through letters, except that the letters from the communities to Paul are lost. We only have this half of the conversation.
A great example, Jean-Francois, I think, is in First Corinthians, where Chloe is referred to, right?
Yes.
And there's a sense that Chloe may have written a letter to Paul expressing her concern about developments in one of the houses or churches in Corinth. And she wants his advice, his counsel, his, again, leading from a distance. He's got to lead somehow. So it's that sense of dialogue that's missing, because we're missing half of the dialogue, right?
Yes. And First Corinthians is probably the best example of letters as conversation, because once in a while Paul cites one piece, one sentence of the letter that the Corinthians have written to him, and it's explicit when he says, now let's address what you have written. And you could picture almost having column quotation marks citing the letter, and here's my answer. Once we also look at these letters, Paul's letters as real letters, they tell us much about what's going on also in these Christian groups. And you don't know you don't know what Paul may have told them in the first place when he met them in person, but there's constant references to what he would have said in his previous dealings, and where he would need to explain more. There's a couple of caveats also when dealing with Paul's letters. This is, a fairly famous painting of Paul at work writing a letter. Now think about it, there are many things wrong in that picture from the late 16th century, early 17th century. First, Paul is sitting at a table and he has a pen, paper. There's a book in the form of a codex open on the desk, while most books at that time were scrolls. But also people typically would write sitting on the ground, and would have their piece of material on which they write on their tie. And would write in this very uncomfortable position. But the other thing is that Paul is writing himself. Actually, Paul's letters were not written by Paul. They were written by a secretary that would likely take dictation. And any person who writes at that time has to prepare the material. We're talking about a piece of papyrus, which is an expensive material. So not anyone, only professional scribes are going to write, because the material is expensive. You don't want to ruin it by having someone who's not competent to write. The scribe also has to draw lines on the sheet of papyrus, has to prepare the ink to write. And how do you get ink? You scrap a chimney to get soot in the chimney. You mix it with some liquid and some sticky liquid to make it stable on the page. You have to make pens by taking pieces of reed that you carve carefully. And this is only at that point that you can start writing. The other thing is that writing on a piece of papyrus is not that easy as what you do on a piece of paper. The pen is often stuck in the fiber of the papyrus. Bottom line, all literature was copied by professional scribes who knew exactly what they were doing. So Paul likely had all the time secretaries to write the letters, which means also that secretaries sometimes can have some latitude in the wording. If they take dictation, they can write exactly what they hear, or sometimes they can, be given some ideas with the instruction of formulate this, to sound correct. Cicero, at some point, would brag about his secretary, who was so smart that he would only give his secretary a few ideas, and the secretary would write a letter, a very good letter, and Cicero would simply sign it. So as you read the letter to the Romans, which is the longest of Paul's letters, you often assume that you're reading Paul's exact word, and that Paul is the one who's writing first the letter to the Romans, until you come to the very end, when you find this. Paul is greeting all sorts of people in Rome, and you hear, I, Tertius, who is writing this letter, also greets you in the Lord. So you've been reading Paul's words, what you assume are Paul's words for 16 chapter, and suddenly Tertius, the person who is really writing the letter under dictation, waves at you saying, oh, hello, I'm here. I'm the one who is penning this letter.
And I think that word dictation, again, paralyzes the membrane of common sense, which is, this is not oral transcription. This is not court reporting. This is not even necessarily the exact words of the exact speech act that Paul's giving. Not to say that Paul doesn't edit and review his letters. So I think we should add that, right, Jean-Francois?
Yes.
There's some latitude. He probably hears the letter again, so he agrees with it, he endorses it. But yes, I'm sure there was some also, as you said, in Cicero's example, some ingenuity that's added as well, possibly, to some of these letters by the secretary.
Yeah, and it's one book by the late Jerome Murphy O'Connor, who explained very well what is the production of literature at that time. And this is applied to Paul, but he gives all these examples from ancient times about how do you actually produce a work with all the mechanics, all the material aspects.
Jean-François?
Yes.
Knowing the extent to which scholarship has gone, has there been some work in the use of words in the letter of Paul that make people able to discern that Paul had 2 or 3 secretaries, that and not by, obviously, because we have only copies of those letters, so they cannot look at the original handwriting, but by the use of word, the use of grammar, we can see that these are Pauline in spirit. So they were issued by Paul, but in writing, they have differences, but they have similarities, these ones. So they might have been written by this secretary and this other by this other unnamed secretary, but that people are able to distinguish that, or have there been no such research done?
There's no such research about individual secretaries. What specialists have been trying to do is to find whether there are phrase patterns that returns, in several letters that indicate that this would be typical of Paul's style when dictating, a letter. And I've been reading in Greek Paul's letters and teaching intermediate Greek to our students for years, using Paul's letters for the more advanced intermediate students. And one thing that you find if you read all of them is at some point they are ways to build sentences that are typically Paul's ways. There's sometimes a way to use ellipsis in Greek that you don't find in the other books of the New Testament. that and even in literature, Greek literature of that time, that makes you feel that, yes, you're dealing with a sentence that Paul would have dictated. And there's also a few uses of what you would call stock phrases in Paul's letters, where that are meant to punctuate sometimes the rhetoric that you find in several letters, and that you don't find in other documents of the New Testament or Christian literature of that time, that makes you feel or guess that you're dealing with dictation. But no, for the scribes, you don't know. The other thing also, think about it. Paul is sending a letter to a group. He would also need to keep a copy for his records. Otherwise, he could be told later that he said something and he has absolutely no recollection or no trace of it. So every time he would send a letter, there would be a copy, 2 copies at least, produced for that letter, one for him and one for the group to whom he's sending it.
That actually reminds me just of this. Jean-Francois, is this the only example we have in the 7 letters that we consider to be, as you say, closer
Yes.
to Paul? Is this the only example we have of a self-disclosed scribe saying, "I greet you"? This is the only one, right? So we actually can't even figure out whether others.
Yes. One thing at the very end of Galatians, Paul says, look at these, look at these big letters. I'm the one who's writing these words myself. And he calls attention to the big letters because a professional scribe could produce neat small letters that are consistently the same size. And Paul here actually says that he's taking the pen to write the final greetings, and it likely looks awkward, clumsy as a hand. If you can see on your screen, this is the earliest manuscript of Paul's letters, Papyrus 46. When you look at a page, there's no paragraph division. There's no, it's all in capital letters. There's no space between words. And of course, there are no subtitles, which means also that reading any of these letters can be a very tedious exercise, because you have to decide for each word, each line, where you separate the words. And it took a few centuries for the production of text to start, making paragraphs, making also dividing the words, putting spaces between the words. Let's go forward. And here's a better example. So this is a papyrus of the earliest manuscript of Paul's letters. It's from about 200. And it's one page of the second letter to the Corinthians. It's called the Papyrus 46, Chester Beatty. Chester Beatty is the name of the person who purchased this papyrus in Egypt. He was an Irish person, wealthy person, and the papyrus now is kept in the Chester Beatty Museum in Dublin, Ireland. I also draw your attention that we only have copies of Paul's letters. We don't have any original document. And we're fortunate because with Paul's letters, as with the other writings of the New Testament, we have several hundreds manuscripts, Greek manuscripts of these letters, without mentioning all the translations in Latin, Syriac, Coptic, Ethiopic, Old Slavonic, Armenian, and all these ancient languages. But if you look at the manuscript tradition, you find that uh, there's often variation among, in the wording of the letters in each manuscript, because people who copy sometimes will change the spelling of some words. The language evolves. And therefore, scribes who copy it 50, 60, 100 years later correct the spelling, because the words are not spelled anymore like this. They sometimes change the word order. They sometimes change a preposition. They change also an article, add an article, delete the article, and things like this. So it's always a kind of living tradition when it's transmitted. I'll say that if you compare it to other writers from antiquity, we're fortunate with Paul to have a document which would be, let's say, a copy of a manuscript that is only 150 years later. You're thinking about Aristotle. Sometimes the manuscript we have was written 1,000 years later, and we have only 2 or 3 manuscripts of some works. But what it means also when you become aware of the alterations made during the transmission of these manuscripts, it's quite naive and myopic to assume that you're reading every time Paul's exact words, or that you're reading every time Plato's, Cicero's, or Aristotle's exact words, because this is not how the transmission of writings work in antiquity until the invention of the printing press. There are constant alterations to the text.
Jean-Francois, I'm curious whether if we think about within text variation by, let's say, Coptic manuscript, or as you mentioned, the many different languages that have been used to transmit these letters, has there been any triangulation? In other words, are there significant differences in the way the letters have been handed down in one language form versus others? People look at those.
Yeah, because each time you translate also, you have the constraints of the language. Think about it, Latin has no article. Mm-hmm. So you add this kind of constraint that something which is definite. In Greek, there's no indefinite article. It's only there's the article or no article. So when there's an article, it's usually understood to be definite. But Latin has no way to mark this up. Verb tenses are also verb tenses and moods are very different from one language to another. Plus, as you know, the semantic range of words are different from one language to another. So if you change language, you're also changing the whole set of semantic connections, possible semantic connections between words. So that's an interesting aspect, that these letters underwent translation, in the very early centuries. And I will say that every time you undergo translation, you're taking a risk in terms of multiplying possible meanings. You lose control even more about meanings. Think about the Quran. The Quran is in Arabic, and the only official, the only authoritative text of the Quran is Arabic. And this is a way also to maintain, the range of semantic, to constrain, to keep control on the range of semantic connections. With Paul's letters, no, by undergoing translation, you completely lose control. of the semantic connections. And this is why also, let's say that Augustine could come up with the idea of the original sin in Romans 5:12 based on his Latin translation of the letter to the Romans.
My recollection is that Augustine self-admitted that he had a bit of challenge with Hebrew. He may have had some form of Hebrew tutor, but it's hard to see that. And so again, this is a very interesting problem, how he's going to read or really have semantic control in Hebrew of Torah when he doesn't have it.
And let's say also that prior to the production of the Vulgate by Jerome, there were two main traditions in Latin translations. There was the Italian translation and the North African translation, and they had nothing to do with each other. So people could come up with some interpretations based on Latin, Italian manuscripts, which would be completely unacceptable when reading the North African Latin manuscripts, because they would be completely apart from each other. And that's why sometimes Augustine would tell, reading the North African, his North African Latin translation would tell about people using the Italian translation that they don't know how to read. Well, they know how to read. They are just not reading the same text.
I was just reading some correspondence between Jerome and Augustine, and they were arguing over a point in one of Paul's letters. And, you know, the presumed view is they were just simply arguing about the meaning or the best way to position the text vis-a-vis the churches. But you have to wonder too, whether there are occasionally some differences, again, in terms of how people read what they consider to be the original meanings of the original text.
Yes.
It's really helpful to problematize this, isn't it? Because again, what you've done today is given us a sense of Paul not only is human, but Paul's letters as utterly within the notion and genre of the times, rather than something that has somehow been mystically extracted.
Yes.
I have three questions, Jean-François. I will ask them three, and you choose which one the order in which you answer them, and whether you have answers to them. The first one is the most philosophically interesting, but perhaps not that interesting historically. Is the reason they don't separate words that they don't have a strong sense of words as opposed to sentences, or is it just a matter of addition, and nobody had thought about space between words? So that's the first question. The second one is, what did they do to send letters from one place to another? How did they go from where Paul was writing to their destination? And third, why is it that we only have only Paul's version of the text, and nobody thought of keeping the other part?
Okay. Let me take the first two questions together because they are related. Space between words. First explanation, the material is costly. So you want to, on the one hand, to maximize your writing surface. The other thing is that we tend to, we're in this society where we access documents through writing. You're dealing with an oral society where this is not unlike a music score or the text of a play. It's not meant to be read in private. It's meant to be performed orally. So what you do, if I gave you a page like this in French or in English and say, okay, read this aloud, you've never seen it, that would be an embarrassing experience for everyone. What you're expected to do is to read this text, to basically memorize it and to deliver it orally. Not unlike what you're supposed to do with a music score. You're supposed to practice it, and at some point to go and perform it in a concert, and you don't probably need your score anymore. The same thing with the play in theater. You're supposed to have memorized the play, and you go there and you memorize, you perform it. How would these letters travel to the communities? There would be a letter carrier, usually one of Paul's co-workers, that would go with the letter, and when there would read the letter to the audience, the community who's there, and would provide also expansion as needed. But this co-worker would already know very much what's in the letter, would have read it enough to perform it. Uh, Remember also that there's no silent reading in antiquity. All reading is done, loud. Remember this anecdote of Augustine coming to see Ambrose in Rome and being surprised that Ambrose is reading a letter of recommendation that Augustine brought with him. And Ambrose is reading silently, his lips are not moving. Augustine is surprised, never seen this. So the default is to read aloud. The third question, remind me what it is.
Why is it that we only get Paul's side of the correspondence and not the other side?
Okay, that's it. And here I tend to agree with a suggestion made by David Trobish in the late 70s. What created interest in Paul's letters was mostly the publication of the Acts of the Apostles, let's say around 9100. With the public, according to Trobish, when the Acts of the Apostles came out, it created an interest for Paul's letters. So Christians began to collect everything they could find about Paul's letters. And, they focused on Paul's letters, and they were really collecting letters that were in very different places. And obviously, some letters were lost. Some of these letters were lost. There's one letter mentioned in First Corinthians that was sent before First Corinthians. There's no trace of it anywhere. So that's what happens. The interest was mostly on Paul's letters because of Acts of the Apostles. And likely the other letters from communities had been lost during these, let's say, something like 30 or 40 years. Hope that addresses this question.
There seems to be another question with the hand up.
Yeah, Claude says
Yes.
I was.
Claude.
Yeah,
Claude?
I have a management question about Paul's organization around him, because you're talking like if he were at the center of a small business.
Yes.
And he was the PDG of the business. How the organization was done? Who worked with Paul?
Yeah, at the beginning of each letter, the first words, well, he always begins with his own name, but he mentions co-workers,
Okay.
Paul and Timothy and Sosthenes, and they change depending of the letters. What you can understand is that Paul had people working with him that could be dispatched to various churches, because he couldn't go there. So he would dispatch his co-workers. They were obviously very devoted people.
Yeah.
Because they would travel hundreds of miles to visit communities. One thing that we'll look also in the second talk is, who are the Christian communities to whom Paul writes? Well, what's the makeup like?
Yeah.
Let me give you a teaser. Assuming that Paul was a tent maker, he was in business.
Okay.
And tent making would mean that you're in contact with many professions. That is, you have your suppliers,
Yeah.
You also have your clients, and you have also traders, people who will transport the thing. So,
Yeah.
and a common assumption about early Christians is that there were a significant proportion of these early Christians who were traders, who would also be traveling from one place to another, who would have relocated from their hometown into a new city because of trades.
Yeah.
And think about how Paul would have created this network of people interested in his ideas about Jesus. He would use his business connections also to connect with people.
So he had two businesses,
Yes.
making and the philanthropic business of developing Christianity.
Yes, and every time also you could say that in every city he came for a significant amount of time, he could exercise his trade.
Yeah.
Cloud.
And we will be talking also how, you know, if you're doing trade, if you're doing making tents, you need space to work. And usually you would be renting space around a house.
Okay.
And you would have a certain access to that house, which would be negotiated. You know,
Okay.
let's say for meals, for, you know, a few things. So
Jean-François, on the same topic,
Thank you.
Jean-François,
Yes.
so does that mean that Titus or Timothy are traders of Paul, or their expenses are paid as by the clients of the tents that are being delivered? Because when I asked you who delivers and how are they delivered those letters, I was indeed thinking of the cost of delivering them. I was thinking, for instance, he might receive a letter 2 or 3 months earlier that must have taken a month to get to him, so that's 4 month distance. But what I mean is that he must have waited till the next trip that was happening between wherever he was and wherever the letter was going. He needed to have, you know, somebody going there.
Yes.
There's no post office system back then.
Yeah, there's a postal service back then which is highly effective, but it's the imperial postal
Roman.
system, which is reserved for Roman officials.
Right.
But
Yeah.
typically, indeed, you would need to find you know, ships, opportunities. Let's call them opportunities for travel. Very often, for, you know, people mostly traveled at that time for business. There was people who traveled for tourism, but they were eccentric people.
Yeah.
You know, I wanted to relate to Cloud's point. You know, how do we think about him? Was it the business driving the spiritual philanthropic work, or was vice versa, or was it both? But also, we've been playing with the notion of entrepreneur. So, you know, when you look at the entrepreneurial literature in business schools, is Paul best described as the leader of an organization? I think not. Is he best described as an entrepreneur? Well, there are qualities, right?
Yes.
But the key idea I think that Jean-François is bringing out is very naturally for him in his own trade and business, he's making contact with all sorts of people. And this is a continuation of those contacts. It's not like he has to invent a material way to support his mission. He's not trying to figure out how to make money to go out and do proselytizing. It's the reverse of that. And I think that's an important point.
Now, I have another question.
And Claude,
go ahead, Jean-François.
Yeah, Claude, also to answer your part of your question, Claude and Jean-François, there's the letter to the Romans explains to you how it got there. At the very end of the letter, you read a two-line letter recommendation on behalf of a lady from Corinth, whose name is Chloe. She's relocating from Corinth to Rome.
Okay.
And what you understand is that she's the one bringing the letter to the Romans there. So she's traveling there. We don't know for what purpose, but she's going to relocate, and you need a carrier. She's the one. She's the most likely fire of the letter.
Okay.
So he's this is one thing we should understand also from your question, Claude, and it's a good one. Christianity, as Paul, as it surfaces in the letter, is not a one-man show.
No.
It's really teamwork, because Paul needs his co-workers
Yeah.
to get the whole thing going. And
Like
sometimes
us.
we focus so much on Paul that we forget that he never sees himself as the person who does everything. He keeps mentioning his co-workers. He keeps also writing using the first person plural, which
Yeah.
is a way to, as we know, it's a way to include
Yeah.
your co-workers.
Yeah.
And that's also a very important aspect of these early Christianity. It's always a collegial endeavor, and I think collegial is perhaps the best term.
Okay, Jean-François, related to this, I have a few questions. They're all related this time. The first is that you're sure that the we that Paul used when he used we is a collegial we, it's not the royal we, it's not the polite way or the academic way of saying I in a letter. So that's the first question. And the second is a chicken and egg question. Is Paul primarily developing business trade and using them afterwards to, business trade relation and using them to spread Christianity, or is he developing first Christian community and using them to develop his business?
I think it's really a chicken and egg question. I think it's a both and. Concerning the first question, can you just?
Well, the first question is just: is it the royal we, as we say in French when we use we, or is it really a collegial we? You're pretty certain that it's a collegial we.
I would say that it's a collegial we in most cases, because here and there, especially in Galatians, he will use the I when he has to explain himself, because he's coming under attack, and he has to explain what he's been doing. So he turns to the I, and not only I, he swears that he's not lying.
I think that's the critical way to reframe that, exactly as where is he under attack? Or another way of putting it more politely, where is there competition for leadership in the community? So we're going to be focusing on 1 Corinthians, not on all the other letters. And in that letter, it's very clear that there is competition for who to follow, who to listen to. And Paul may be using the royal we as a rhetorical device as well there to say, we all know that what we experienced is something that we ought to remember. And he contrasts that with, I know you have heard from Peter, I know you've heard from Apollos, but he wants to remember us of something. So I think it's strategic as well. But Jean-François, thanks for reminding us, right, that across different letters, he will switch depending on what's going on.
He will switch, but I wouldn't dismiss easily that sometimes it's, the royal we. It could be in a few cases.
So the royal we does exist in ancient Greek and ancient Latin.
Perhaps not as we see, we look at it nowadays.
Good. I have another question.
Yeah, go ahead, Claude.
Yeah, you said that some of the Jewish ideas were known in the Roman circles and the Greek circle, and people would have liked to adhere to this idea, but not to the constraint of the Jewish religion. So was the Christian Jewish new religion appealing because it was like the light Jewish?
Yeah, let me expand on this. What we find in this the first century Mediterranean is that there may have been some kind of dissatisfaction toward traditional Greek or Roman religions.
Yeah.
which created an interest for, let's say, Jewish traditions that would be considered as ancient and full of wisdom. There would be also interest in ancient Egyptian religions. You
Okay.
see a flourish of Egyptian cults in Greco-Roman cities at that time. The best parallel I could find nowadays is in North American societies, the interest for Buddhism.
Or New
Eh,
Age
yeah,
philosophies.
yeah, and you also realize that sometimes interest for Buddhism is interest for some aspects of Buddhism.
Yeah.
What prompts this interest for Buddhism is that sometimes people are dissatisfied with what they know of Christianity.
Yeah.
So they turn to currents, and Buddhism. This is not also necessarily an accident. This is an ancient tradition, and you consider that it's ancient. There's wisdom acquired through the centuries and these traditions. Uh, you know, and it tells something about how when a society at some point becomes dissatisfied with some currents of thoughts and is shopping around for something else. So that's exactly what was going on at that time. Plus, there was a movement of population, which was made possible by the Roman road system, which had been built recently, and also booming trade because the Romans had made also traveling by sea safer. They had, taken piracy seriously and were making sure that trade routes remained open and safe. And therefore, people moved from one place to another and brought new ideas in these cities.
Okay.
I think Cloud's question also is a great one because I think it actually raises the question, who were the Corinthian
Yeah.
Yes.
congregation goers? They may have been, quote unquote, well, we've been using the term non-Jew. We could say Greek, right, or Gentile. They may have just been people shopping, but they also may have been people who had some affinity or experience with what we call Judaism, which I was trying to figure out with Jean-Francois. How much do we know in the Corinthian congregations whether there were, in fact, people who had been to the equivalent of some kind of Jewish synagogue experience practice in Corinth and who
Yeah.
migrated with Paul through business? Maybe they met him, they liked him, they agreed there was something going on, but we don't even know that, right? We don't have a good markers for what were the so-called more organized forms of religion in Corinth. We know a lot, don't we, Jean-Francois, about the temple rituals of pagans.
Yes.
We know that those things were active and engaged, and Paul comments on them. But we don't really know what the Jewish community looked like in Corinth. So we have to make this assumption that it was all Gentiles, but maybe that's not even correct.
That may not be even correct. Also, Corinth at that time was what you would call nowadays a boom town. That is a town that was undergoing a rapid growth. And of course, it was not because of the birth rate. It was because people were moving in from all sorts of places. And, displaced people are sometimes more open to new currents, new ideas that they bring with them, but also they don't fit into the established existing social network, and they create new networks based on other values.
So it was a carrefour.
Yes, exactly.
And people from other towns knew that Corinth was interesting as a carrefour.
Yes, yeah, it was an attractive city at that time. And you may think about nowadays some cities that are the equivalent, that suddenly become attract a lot of people because they offer many opportunities.
Okay.
And Jean-François Garneau had a question.
Yes,
I believe.
I think I never was as interested in Paul scholarship as I am now. I think you're raising extremely interesting interesting ideas. So two questions, that, and I'm sorry if I put you on the spot because I don't know whether there can be answers to them. The first one, is among the scholars who have had, are there scholars who have had the same intuition that the two of you have had? And if so, has there been any work trying to decipher whatever clues there may be in the letters that, what were Paul's original trade routes and which are the ones he developed as he writes his letters? He probably inherited his tent-making business from his family and had a number of trade routes that he inherited, and then he developed new ones. We tend to present the letters as if he developed everything from the ground up. He may have started with the already existing post that he was working with without developing his religious mission. Then some of them he kept only for business because they didn't want to hear about the religion. Other became both, and other became developed either for trade or for business. Obviously, this is not what the letters intend to convey, so it's difficult to try to decipher. But has there been some work? So that's the first question. And the second one, and it bears on perhaps on the reason why Paul was not taken as seriously in the first century as later, is that I refer to the shock I had when my Oxford friend I met, McCullough, he wrote his 4,000 Years of Christianity, and suddenly made clear that in fact the Christianity of the West, that we tend to think as paradigmatic of Christianity, was in fact a minority Christianity, and that the Christianity of the East and even of the Far East and the South in Ethiopia was far more developed for a long period of time, while the West was only an embryo. So my question is, did it develop in the East, the Far East, and the South in Ethiopia by trade routes and this way, or is this original to Paul, this way of developing? You understand what I'm trying to say? Is the fact that Paul is a trader some sort of lower status to his spreading religion, as opposed to more highly, purely religious, priestly, or whatever you might have in other part of the world, and making Baghdad Christianity or Damascus Christianity or
Alexandrian Christianity?
Yeah, more prestigious. And the other one bourgeois. What thoughts do you have on this?
Yeah, the first question about existing trade routes, I would say that, like, one thing that you realize, Paul and early Christianity, established and promoted by Paul, is really an urban phenomenon. There's no evidence that Paul would travel to rural places. So he would always go to cities, and typically fairly important cities. That tells you something also about the importance of trade there, because this is where there are people, there are resources. And I will say that there's no actual resource probably about trade routes for, let's say, specific to some businesses, but we always find that Paul is going to major centers. The only exception is Galatia.
Those are the hinterlands.
Yeah, hinterland. And you have to ask yourself, what the heck is Paul doing in Galatia in the middle of nowhere? The most common explanation is that he would cut through Galatia to go somewhere else. And this is where how he ended up in Galatia was likely delayed by something. But all the time, he's traveling to major cities. If you had to name also a headquarter for Paul during his ministry, it would be Ephesus. Ephesus was a major city in Asia Minor, was on the coast. Was also an administrative center, important administrative center. It's not unlikely that he spent several years in Ephesus and used it as a headquarter toward sending coworkers to other places.
So one of the portraits, right, Jean-Francois, that's being developed to describe, kind of to get at your point, what do these folks look like? They're urban.
Yes.
They're what we might call middle class, although we all know those categories don't really work, but we can at least say that they're people who do trade and business. And I think to the other point, was Paul a philosophically minded, literate, well-read, in quotes, Alexandrian? I don't think so.
No.
I don't see him that way. In fact, I think that's when you ask the question, why did things flourish in other places? I don't think we can pin it on one person or one type or one personality or one,
Yes.
typology. But I just would like to say, Jean-Francois, that I think if Paul is urban and if he's largely a business person and if he works mostly in communities of people like him, there really is a question in Paul's congregations about how diverse they are in terms of social class.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that becomes very important for later Christian movements, obviously in the Catholic Church as well, where people are thinking about, for example, a poverty service oriented approach. I don't think Paul brings that. I don't think Paul is bringing the Galilean Yeshua, who is mostly working with fishermen. That's not Paul. And I think that's an important point, that how he gets retrieved from later Christians into the corpus is not because he looks a lot like Jesus's early ministry. It's because he seems to be able to form things, and he's good at forming them and discoursing with people on how to form and keep moving towards a goal together.
So
And we get a
sense,
picture of that.
In that sense, Paul is really Roman, because he provides laws, he provides organization. It's a sort of commonplace of saying Romans brought laws and organization where Greeks only brought ideas and philosophy.
Yeah, there's obviously an organizational talent with Paul. And this is where we're going also with the second talk, is what do we mean when we're talking about the church in Corinth in terms of organization? Because you don't necessarily build it from scratch. You're using structures, types of organizational structures that already exist in these societies. And you organize the groups according to the known structures, especially when it comes to leadership. But this is for next week. About your second question, Jean-Francois, I heard two questions.
Yeah.
One was about, Paul not being taken very, not being an important thinker in the first centuries.
It's because you said that the early Christians didn't attach much importance to his thought.
That's true, because you also have to think about what is theology doing in the first few centuries? What are the major theological questions? What is driving the agenda? And to which documents do you turn to really deal with the agenda? A major agenda item in the first centuries was, the person of Jesus. What is he? All the debates about is Jesus a human being adopted by God? Is he God divine from the start, etc.? So this is a discussion that goes on for the first few centuries, and Paul's letters don't have much to contribute in that discourse. There could have been much to find in Paul, but actually the early Christian writers mostly turned to the Gospel of John. They mostly turned to the other Gospels. And it's, we should owe to Augustine also the rediscovery of Paul as a theologian.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Even though Augustine, in my sense, did much damage while rediscovering Paul, he also put Paul back on the Christian map as a thinker. And of course, we had to wait until the end of the 4th century and the beginning of the 5th century for Augustine. But also Augustine had this kind of heavy personality that made everything he wrote and said be considered important.
Without going too much on the down on Augustine and then the trace to Luther piece of this story, I think, Jean-Francois, one thing that I've enjoyed in my naive and encounters with Paul's Corinthians letter, which we'll get to next time, is he was not troubled by the problem of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost.
No.
He was not troubled by the problem of, which was very much on the minds of 1st and 2nd century Christians, the relationship between the Father and the Son. In fact, the way I'm reading him, and again, Jean-Francois, you can help me with my lack of Greek and maybe the translations I have access to, but I don't see that problem. I see him as knowing who the Father is, which is Yahweh. Sorry, but I think it is Yahweh. And then he knows that the Son, in the form of Christ, however we want to define that, is Messiah. So the Messiah has come for Paul. He's here. It's occurred. And he's trying to figure out how to tell the Greeks the good news.
Yes.
But what that good news is not a debate about the relationship between the Father and the Son. And that makes him different, I think, as well, in terms of how we read him in his own context.
Yeah, that's right. There are many questions that Christians found important in the 4th century, in the first 4 centuries, that finally Paul doesn't address or doesn't have much to contribute to. The second half of your question, Jean-Francois, was about, this development of Christianity in all these directions and the colors that it took. Let's say that indeed Christianity developed in all these regions, and sometimes we completely neglect the differences in outlook. And there's a way, especially in Western Christianity, to see itself as the center of the world. How in the Western Christianity, how the perspective is that Rome has displaced Jerusalem. That's almost a core conviction in Western Christianity that is obviously not shared in Eastern Christianity.
Constantinople is forgotten.
Yeah, in Eastern Christianity, Rome has never displaced Jerusalem.
You're right, and even my if I go further, and also to bring you back to my question there. So Paul developed a network of trade-related Christians.
Yes.
And one of the things that strikes me, if I think further along this, and I had never thought of that, but I'm piecing together information I have, is that when you're taught your catechism in earlier, you tend to think that the church was built by Paul. That if it hadn't been for Paul, it would have only been Jerusalem and a few things. And my knowledge, I had never put that into words, but even in the West, he might not have been the most important one. The church in Rome was already founded when he goes there. The Church of Alexandria is already founded by some other people. There is archaeological evidence that besides the network of traders, there has been a network of soldiers, of Roman soldiers who were Christians and left. Actually, we have archaeological evidence of their Christian practice at a number of places. And then there's all this Eastern Christianity that developed with other things. So my point is, first, I realized very clearly in a way that I had never, is that Paul is just one among many, and his network of churches is not the church at all. It might even be only a small section of whatever Christian church existed at the time. And so my question, if I reformulate it, is that beside a church of trader, I can see a church of more clearly diaspora Jew in the sense of post-temple fall of the temple Jew, like for instance Irenaeus and his community that go to Lyon. They're really, it's the the destruction of the Jewish Holy Land, and they leave in that function, and they're Jewish in exile in Lugdunum in France, and that's how they started. They have nothing to do with Paul. They have to do, if anything, with John. Then there's and then the same the about the Ethiopian church, how it develops, how all these other churches develop. So Paul is not at all the founder of the church. Paul is only one among many who do that, and his network might not even be the most important one at the time.
Yes, yeah.
And the other network are not necessarily trade related, and that was the question: how many, in terms of type of network that provided Christianity, what are the alternative network besides trade routes, trade?
Yeah, there are several networks that develop. Think also about India.
Yeah.
As you mentioned, Alexandria, Syriac Christianity is extremely important in the first 3 centuries. All these networks. One thing, that makes Paul also, the reason why he has gained some status is, again, I would say that he had the promoter with the Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah.
Because what does the Acts of the Apostles is basically to decide who's important, who's worth your attention in that developing movement. Notice that when you read the Acts of the Apostles, the first 10 chapters are mostly about Peter. One chapter about Philip in Samaria, and Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch. But at some point, the author of the Acts of the Apostles decides that Paul is the important person. And you won't hear any more about Peter. You won't hear any more about Philip. You won't hear that much about James. You'll hear only about Paul. The author of the Acts of the Apostles has decided that this is what you need to know, and the rest is unimportant. There's something of an agenda at work here about telling you this is where you should put your attention. You could challenge this, but we're still stuck with this agenda in many ways.
I think, Jean-Francois, you pointed out that we're following Knox here, and Knox points out that actually it's not the case that Luke, or the Lucian writer of Acts, is looking at Paul's letters and sifting through them to determine anything biographical. Mm-hmm. So I think we have to, again, dispel that notion. It's not like this person's got a series of Paul's letters and saying, well, let me pull some of this and find out about the falling off the horse. And let me find out that he went and, he tried to approach the Jews, but was pushed away. I mean, all of this is in some sense manufactured from storytelling that seems to be, as you said, Jean-Francois, motivated to promote Paul, perhaps even over Peter. But I want to go back to Paul. So yes, Acts is parallel. It's sitting over there and it's influencing us, but it's not influencing Paul.
No,
Paul has no connection to it. In fact, if anything, he seems to be more interested in fragments and oral traditions of the Gospels that we call the Gospels. He didn't pick up the Gospels per se, but he's interested in the story of Jesus, which is also strangely absent from his letters because he doesn't say really very much about Jesus, which always was curious to me. So I go back to when he's leading with the knowledge that Jesus Christ is the way for the Greek, but he's not expounding theologically on that very much.
No.
And he's not necessarily even describing to us or anyone else that he's arguing with about why his view of Jesus is more relevant, more important than another person's view. And it goes back to the point that there were many Jewish Christ-believing communities in proximity, even in his region. He wasn't the only person talking about Messiah come as Christ for those communities. So yes. I just feel like it's important to kind of separate that out again in his time for him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would, everything you say, and I would add that we mostly know Paul through the Acts of the Apostles at first. Acts of the Apostles may have never seen any letter of Paul. uh, and it's interesting also that Paul defines himself, how we know about Paul from Paul is that he writes letters. Acts never depicts Paul writing any letter, writing anything. Many people write letters in the Acts of the Apostles, but Paul doesn't.
In fact, in Acts, he's given a speech and it says, this is Paul speaking. And as Knox points out, there's no evidence whatsoever in any of Paul's writing that he ever spoke in that way. So there's manufactured, not just dialogue, but speeches.
Yes.
And this is, again, a concern. It reminds me of why Acts feels so unreliable when you really dig in. So why not go back and try to piece together what Paul said on Paul's terms with the communities that Paul's in dialogue with? I think that's the argument we're making in this series.
Yeah,
I find that most interesting. But I need to ask you, just because you raised this point. I'm sorry, it forces you to speak about Luke, not about Paul, and I know you're desperate, especially Brent, to go back to Paul. But it will nag me all the time, this question: why does Luke does this? Why does he put it in, or Luke, or whatever Lucian author puts Paul in the center in Acts, and what is that community that feels the need to put Paul in, and that is not Paul, so that I can keep them really apart? I need just a little more on Luke and Acts on this.
Yes, one thing that I see, well, we cannot know the author's intention. We simply can see the effect. The effect is that what becomes at some point important is the spread of this movement in the Greco-Roman speaking world. There's and I think that corresponds to Luke's vision of the world. The world for Luke, for the author of the Acts of the Apostles, may promote a Greco-Roman outlook on everything. And this, also may promote also something of the Roman Empire, the perspective of the Roman Empire, because, what's the price at the end of the Acts of the Apostles? What's the big price after which Paul is to get to Rome?
Right. Yeah, everything leads up to this great final conclusion, which suggests to me a polemic of we need to assert, it's almost like the canon being formed. We have to assert that this is the way. And by creating this narrative of Paul as the savior who realizes, I was a failed Jew, Judaism at once for me was all there was, and now I know the truth, and the truth is to go out and do this to get my way to Rome, to bring in the congregations of my formation. Again, it just sets Paul up as separate him further again from something called the complexity of his own practice, which would be the contested leadership and the attempt to form and sustain groups. It's, you just erase all those problems in these narratives and you tell a story about a hero. And Acts is a story about a hero, really, in my mind. Do you think so, Jean-Francois?
Yes, and Acts also provides you a coherent picture of the development of the movement. In reality, there may not be, an unfolding plan about the development, but when you read Acts, you get the sense that, yes, there's a plan and we follow it carefully. The plan is given in the first verses of the Acts of the Apostles. And from reading the first verses, how this thing is going to unfold.
I think there's also a legitimation function, right?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Jean-Francois, I got excited about this problem that I've seen a lot with Acts, which is that somehow we need to show that Paul has real credentials, that Paul really is a Jew, but he's seen something more. And I think a lot of people would have looked at Paul as Jews in that time, in that early movement, and said, no, Paul doesn't quite have it right. Paul isn't the only person here. We have to remember the battles for the transition from Jews for Jesus to just Christians is going on for 300 years. It's a process of expelling these people, the Ebionites, for example, getting rid of these people. And so I feel like Acts is an arc to that. It's like, how do we start to get them out? Not literally, but in the sense of we have our own path, and Paul is our path.
Yes.
Francois, I'm sorry, I needed to insert that for a moment.
But the just to push you a little more to understand your position is that I realize, because I had never thought of that, and some ideas are coming back to my mind. I know Luke mostly in recent year by the novel of Emmanuel Carrère on Luke, that was very famous in French. Recently published. And one of the things that Carrère insists on is that in the book of Acts, Luke is writing at the first person, and then at one point he started to write at the first person plural. He's moving from first person singular to first person plural, and he seems to be a disciple of Paul. What you're saying and what you're saying at the very minimum is that he sorts of half betrays, half expands Paul. If you can clarify, but I sense that you're saying something even more, that Luke has nothing to do with Paul, that he never was a disciple of Paul.
Yeah, I'm adamant that Paul writes in 100. So Paul has been dead for
You mean
several
Luke?
years,
Luke
30
writes.
to
Luke
30 to 40
Luke
years.
writes, because Paul's done by 50, 60, right?
Yeah,
Jean-Francois, you said. So you meant to say Luke, right?
So Luke
Yes.
has nothing to do with Paul.
Luke has nothing to do with Paul. What you mentioned about the first person, the use of the first person plural at some point in Acts chapter 16, there's a switch to the first person. We boarded the ship, we crossed to Macedonia. The best explanation about this is a literary device. That happens right after Paul and Barnabas split. They were together for the first part of the journeys, and there's a fallout between them, and they split. And so Paul is going to go his way, and Barnabas is going to go his way. At this moment, the first person plural, starts. And the literary device would be that so far, Paul always had a companion. He's lost Barnabas. So the we becomes the new companion. When Paul arrives in Jerusalem in chapter 21, he's arrested and he goes to jail. At that moment, it's not anymore the first person plural. It switches to the third person singular. When Paul is freed from, leaves prison and goes to Rome, the first person plural, we, is waiting for him at the gate of the prison and now joins him to go to Rome. So what you understand with we, it's always to make sure that Paul is not alone. While he loses Barnabas, he needs a companion. So you bring the companions into the picture. So it has nothing to do with an eyewitness.
Luke being there and Luke not being there.
Yeah, it has nothing to do with an eyewitness. It's simply a literary device. And again, the whole perspective is to make sure that Christianity, early Christianity, is never a one-man show.
Yeah. And I think that,
Jesus always has disciples.
right.
Peter is always with John at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles, even though John doesn't say a single word. He's always mentioned standing by Peter, who does the whole talking and everything else. So when Paul is with Barnabas, Barnabas doesn't do much talking. Paul does the talking. But, Barnabas is constantly mentioned. When he loses Barnabas, you need someone else to take, to have a sidekick.
So that's the thing about, too, that clearing the table today and setting the table is going exactly to the point of getting Luke/Acts
out of the picture.
It's not out in its proper place. its proper place is not to use as a lens to read Paul, rather to see it as a biographical, to some extent, I would say polemical. Jean-Francois may say something different account, but the point is it's over here, whereas Paul's letters are actually rich in leadership stories, rich in stories about organization and association and communication, rich in dialogue that we don't see the other side of, but we can infer quite a bit about what was on the minds of the community. So to me, that's where the real rich, exciting part of this is. Whereas Acts, I think, is just a filter, almost like Kant's rose-colored glasses, which keeps you from seeing really the you might say, gold inside of that work, yes. Which is important.
Yeah, just an anecdote about this. I was on a doctoral committee at one time with, and there was a professor from University of California, Berkeley in political science. And we were talking about, Luke, Acts. We usually say Luke, Acts with a hyphen between. To speak about a single work in 2 volumes. And when we were explaining how Luke, craft the story in Acts, he suggested to recoin the term, and I put it in the chat. He says, Luke Acts. Puts an act together about the early Christian movement. And there's something about this. We have Luke impersonating the eyewitness at some point, but he's in a way playing an act on us. And when you were talking also, Jean-Francois, about the situation of the author of Luke, notice how in the Gospel according to Luke, he's so bad about Palestinian geography. Gets many things completely wrong when it comes to geography of Palestine. When you go to the Acts of the Apostles, he shows an extensive knowledge of all the cities and traveling from one place to another in Asia Minor and Macedonia and Greece. So that tells us something about the geographical and cultural location of that person.
Tell me again, because I sort of spaced out when you were talking at the beginning of your answer. So you're saying Luke is confused about his geography of Palestine and is reliable on his geography of the rest of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, Luke is notoriously mistaken sometimes about geography in Palestine. While when you come to the Acts of the Apostles, without saying that he's a cartographer and he gets everything very precisely, he shows a more reliable understanding of the geography in Asia Minor, Macedonia, and Greece. And in my sense, that tells us something about the geographical location of that person and also the cultural location of that person. That is, this author thinks it's, you need to be precise when it comes to Asia Minor, but you can be lousy when it comes to Palestine.
When I was in Malta some years ago, and actually I was on the island of Gozo, I remember going to the purported place where Paul was shipwrecked, Jean-Francois. And at the time, I wasn't following quite the level of detail that we're doing now with Paul's travels. But one of the things that struck me, and again, I don't know whether this is reconstructed from Acts primarily, it must be, but this idea of you show the map where yes. The plans to go and where he was, and almost everyone I've been reading sort of says it's almost impossible to really come up with a very clear picture either of the timeline, the direct locations. Ephesus seems clear, that's sort of straightforward enough. Rome seems clear, but there are other places where it's just very jumbled. So again, we go back to, in our minds, there's this Paul who did these routes and they're known, just like there's the geographical locations. It's just not quite that simple, is it?
No, it's not very simple. And I think if you had told Paul you're doing your second journey or your third journey, he would have asked you, what are you talking about?
I
There
thought
may
this was
not be,
Papa.
a plan for doing 3 journeys and, telling himself, I'm in the middle of the second journey, or I'm about to start the third journey with that route. May not be that planned.
This is
This
this
is
is
not the
where we
impression that you get from Paul's letters.
this is where we've appropriated for the purposes of missionary theology today.
Yes.
The idea that Paul is going on his 2-year mission and he's going to a place and he's going to do X, Y, and Z, and then he's going to return and then go do it again. To me, it's exactly our agenda around missionary theology that
Yes.
Paul wouldn't have thought that way. It would have been more organic, perhaps, for him than
Yeah,
that.
likely more organic. But the thing again is that once you pay attention to the letters themselves, you don't see, once in a while you have at the end of a letter some announcement about travel plans, but they don't go very far.
Can I
You don't
make a
get the
comment?
itinerary.
Yeah, you
Can I
don't get
make a
the,
commentary? It's not a question. Is that at first I thought that in this first talk, you would just provide background, and indeed you did on this. And I thought generally that your point would be more a marginal point about the way to look at Paul's work and so on, the through leadership. And you were because there had been, and I actually said that to some people, that you too, there had been so many things written about Paul that people had to invent new angles of approach to do that. And now I realize you're saying something fundamental about Paul. It's not a sideshow. It's really, you extirpate a Paul the trader and his trade routes, and you say if you want to understand him, you need to understand him as an entrepreneur who's developing his business, and is developing in part of this business, he's conveying his ideas and things that change his life in the way of doing things. And I find that from the little I know about the literature, the specialized literature about Paul, profoundly insightful. So I'm impressed by what I'm hearing this morning, and I haven't even heard the 2 more talks. But I was thinking you were going to make a interesting but marginal point, and I realize you're doing something very important about the way we need to understand Paul.
yeah, and I think that the one key point is to take Paul seriously as a diaspora Jew. What I mean by there is someone who is used to the Greco-Roman culture, who's used to move around in that culture, but also has this Jewish outlook on things. He's also, as a diaspora Jew, familiar with Greco-Roman culture, he's into trade. He's involved into trade with all the network of relationships that trade implies. So once you take seriously this kind of location, you see how this person can be so interesting about moving across cultures. And also connecting with people, all sorts of people in different ways. Always, having one foot in the Greco-Roman culture, but also one foot into Judaism. So in terms of what you call cultural passeur, someone who pass, ideas from one culture to the other, he's ideally fit for that kind of work. Plus, someone who has who shows also a skill at getting a network of co-workers, people who seem actually extremely devoted to him.
If I look at perhaps you are going to talk about that in your later talks, but or perhaps you try to find. Are there any other people who do the same sort of thing, not necessarily with the same ideas in antiquity or later, that you can compare Paul 2 and do a comparative analysis, or there's no one who's left letters who seem to be doing that same. So it's
Oh
just
yeah,
a mix of.
there's a ton of
Okay, so
work
you can do comparative analysis and see where Paul is original compared to others who were traders and ideas passer.
Yes. Yeah. So, the problem with that field is really to, to sort through the morass of documents of publication. There's no way who can really follow everything that's published. But I think we could bring this talk to an end just to give you some idea. Next week, we're focusing on Corinth. Who are the Corinthians in terms of social class? Also, what are the kinds of associations, leadership structures, and where does Paul fit into this? And that will bring us to this idea of leadership. And I remind you that it's always, it's a leadership that is often contested. So it's quite interesting to see how Paul responds to challenges to his leadership. And also how much also this church undergoes all sorts of tensions and conflicts. And there's a whole issue of conflict management when it comes to Corinth. And as you know, you see good leaders in difficult situations. When you're navigating on the calm sea, this is not where you see good leaders. You see them in times of crisis and challenges. So there's plenty of challenges in Corinth from what you can see in the Corinthian correspondence, and that gives us many case studies about leadership, the exercise of leadership and conflict management.
Jean-François, can I ask you for one favor, because you gave your talk in English? You will send the MP4, and if you can do the YouTube magic, because those who had difficulty with English will be able to use the subtitle function.
I don't know, because I have to really break it into segments when I do YouTube. And this is what takes a while.
Okay, no, then too bad, but it was a very good talk. I can't wait for next week.
Yes.
Are there any other questions before we close this session? No, there doesn't seem, Jean-François. So
2.5 hours.
Yeah. So see you next week. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.